Thanks for checking out the Anchor Church podcast. If you want to know more about upcoming events, listen to past messages, or find out about our Connect groups, please download the app. Also, if you would like to fill out your information, click on the Connect button below. If this message has impacted you and you feel led to give and support us financially, please click on the Give button below this video. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
I do want to get right in because we're in an awesome series right now called Painted Deserts. We've been going through the beginning of the Bible, literally, chronologically. We started in Genesis. Now we're in the book of Exodus. Last week we began it. And so if you need to know where to turn in the Bible, turn to the second book. That's where we're going to be the whole day. We're not going to jump around. We are going to be in the book of Exodus. But man, I've just been enjoying the fall weather, though. Is anybody else, I know I said this earlier a second ago, but is anybody enjoying fall? We had fall for a minute, and then it snowed, and everybody was like, oh no, winter's here, and we didn't even get to enjoy fall. But now fall is back, right? Anybody enjoying it? We get fall round two, because it's Ohio, and no one knows what the weather is. I was at, we have a men's Connect group that I meet with, a small group of guys, and we had Connect group last night. And I was pulling into the Starbucks parking lot, and I'm like, what is that huge pile in the middle of the parking lot? And it was snow that was still there. My mind is not ready for winter yet. I still want, fall and stuff. And there's this huge pile of snow. I'm like, what the heck is going on? That should not be there. But the leaves are falling. Anybody Christmas decorated to the max already? Yeah? We are in my house. I'm not judging because we're those people. We got 2 Christmas trees up, all the decorations, all my neighbors have their lights going, and we are those people that go right from Halloween to Christmas. There is no Thanksgiving. It's just all Thanksgiving decorations or Christmas decorations. But we were talking last night in my Connect group with the weather and stuff, and we were talking about yard work. Who loves yard work? John Cruz, our worship pastor, loves yard work. Yeah, there's like 3 of you in here. Nate, why are both of your hands not up? That's your job. You chop down trees and do this stuff for fun. And this man he probably sleeps with his machete because it's his best friend. And that sounds weird. I don't know if I should say that in church. But anyway, but if you love yard work, you're going to not understand this story. You're going to be like, what's your problem? I have a love-hate relationship with leaves. Anybody like this? Anybody love raking leaves in the place? Nobody. Man, even the yard work people hate raking leaves. I don't like raking leaves because I feel like I rake and then something happens the next day. I'm like, man, my yard looks good. Well, we had Propel at our house, and I've actually figured out a life hack that I might have talked about before. I figured out how to cheat the rake leafing system. You raise the deck on your mower and put a bag on the back of it, and you just go over that stuff. It sucks it right up. That is how I rake leaves because I'm 6'5" and my back hurts if I'm raking too long. And so Lauren had Propel, and I went through the yard, got all the leaves up, put them out at the curb. I was so proud of my yard. I was like, I just kept looking out the window. Anybody like that when you mow or do yard? I'm like an old man at heart. I just look out the window at my grass. I'm already keeping kids off of it. Don't touch my lawn. Don't mess it up. And so I'm looking at my yard, and it looks so good. And what do you think happens 2 days later? It rains and the wind's blowing. There are leaves everywhere again. I hate raking leaves because it's like painting a wall. You have to do multiple coats. I want one coat and done. I want to rake once, see the progress, and feel good about it. But yard work is a process. Yard work can be discouraging. One of the guys in our Connect group, we were talking about his backyard and how it grows like crazy weeds and it overgrows. And he's like, I just ignore it. I just ignore the yard work. And then he has a jungle. So then he has to get his dad and family to come over to help him clear it out because he's got jungle yard because he doesn't want to take care of it. Anybody like that? I know there's a couple of you guys that have houses that you do not take care of your yards. And that's okay though, right? It's all right. Because it is a process that can be discouraging at times. We all get there. We all not everybody likes pulling weeds unless you're a psychopath, right? That's what if you like pulling weeds, something's wrong with you. And it is a discouraging process to take care of a lawn. So if you're a cheater, you get out there with Roundup and you just spray it all dead, right? And you ignore the cancer scares and all that stuff. You're just like, it's gone. I don't have to worry about it. But It can be a discouraging process to take care of your yard. It can be a discouraging process to face trials or to get a job done and something happens and it comes back against you. And so as I was preparing for this sermon and fall's happening and I'm fighting the battle of the leaves in my yard and everybody has that one tree that it doesn't drop until like halfway through December. And I was thinking about this idea of facing trials. And maybe leaf raking or pulling weeds or taking care of your yard seems like a silly trial, but sometimes life can feel like tending to a garden. You make progress, you get out what you need, and it just seems, those weeds just seem to find a way back into your life. And I think sometimes we get into the process, and maybe it's like the yard work thing. You get it looking real nice, and the weeds come back, or something comes against us, and we just give up. We just walk away from it. We say it's done. Like it's a useless act to try to fix this. And so this morning I want to talk about how when we face dysfunction, how when we face trials, how do we push through to get to the end? Because the reality is 100% of us in this room are facing some sort of trial right now. 100% of us. It's not, a lot of times I get up here and I would say like, well, most of us are dealing with this, but I would say every single person in this room, there is something in your life that looks like a mountain right now. So when you're facing a mountain, how do you find joy when you're standing in the shadow of a mountain? How do you find joy in the process? And so this morning we're going to be in Exodus 14. And last week we talked about Moses. If you want to turn there while I'm catching you up. Last week we talked about Moses and how he goes before this bush and God says, I'm going to send you back to the most powerful man in the world and you're going to free my people. And Moses has this moment where he battles with God and he says, I'm not good enough, I can't do it. And he goes through all these things. And God says, I created you, I've made you, just do what I say, basically. Anybody ever have that conversation with your kids? I don't care, just do what I say. Go. I don't care if your feet hurt or whatever's going on. Just go and do it. And so God says, just go and do it. And finally, Moses gives in. And he goes to Egypt, and I'm going to catch us up. All these miracles happen. He faces trial, and God shows up and does these great miracles. And all the Israelites are seeing God move, and the plagues come in. And Pharaoh's just getting his butt kicked at this point. Like everything, there's locusts flying around, and frogs, and waters turn into blood. It's like a horror movie happening. And so he gets to this point where Pharaoh, after the final plague comes through, the angel of death, and all the firstborns are killed, which seems very graphic, but we love to tell this story in kids' church. But God comes through, and Pharaoh finally says, I give up. Take them, get them out of here. I'm tired of all these plagues. Just go. I don't care. Leave. And so Moses gathers everyone up, and they start off on this journey to the promised land, to where God had promised them he was going to send them there. He's taking them back to the land that he promised to Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, and he's taking them back into the land that was theirs. And so the story picks up in Exodus 14, verse 5. This is going to be our passage for the day. It says, when word reached the king of Egypt that the Israelites had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their mind. He releases them. He sees, oh wait, they actually left. He realized I just lost all of my workforce. It says they changed their minds. What have we done letting all these Israelite slaves go away, they asked. So Pharaoh harnessed his chariot and called up his troops. He took with him 600 of Egyptians' best chariots. So that's not 600 men, that's 600 chariots. Basically, army tanks of the Old Testament. He gathers 600 of them together along with the rest of the chariots of Egypt, and each with its commander, and he gathers them up to go after the Israelites. He says, I let them go. I'm stupid. I'm going to go and get them back. And so he goes after him. He's going to take him out. Let's fast forward to verse 10. As Pharaoh was approaching, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. There is a group of people with an army coming forth. Can you imagine if you looked out your front window this morning and army tanks were rolling into your neighborhood? You would be in a bit of a panic. And if you're not, then you're one of those doomsday prepper people and you have like a army bunker under your house. And so they're looking up and this whole army is coming after them. And it says the Egyptians are overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord and they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us out to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave? Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone, let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness." So the Israelites have seen God move. They've seen his power. Moses does what God says. He shows up. God is showing up. He frees them. He actually gets them. They don't want to live in bondage. Moses gets them out of slavery with the hand of God. And up to this point, the Egyptians had ruled. They were the world power at this point. And the Israelites had lived in Egypt for around 430 years. So they've forgotten the things of Abraham. That's a legend to them. The story of Joseph was not a real thing. These are slaves that have grown up in slavery, and their children have grown up in slavery. Their whole family, they are generationally slaves at this point. And Moses comes in and he gathers them out. He says, God has a land for you. And he takes them. And they're on this journey, and Pharaoh comes bearing down, and all of a sudden, they start freaking out. They want to turn back. They want to go back to Egypt. Why? See, I think there's a truth for us today. I think there's something important for us to take away from this passage. Maybe you don't live in slavery like the Israelites did, but we all live slaves to certain things in our lives. We all live in bondage to certain things in our lives. And so why do they go running back? And I think it's a natural part of our human nature. And it's that we naturally retreat back to what we know instead of finding a new faith or purpose in the unknown. Anytime we are faced with a trial, we have a natural human instinct, all the way back to the book of Genesis, right? We talked about it for a month, that when trial comes, when you're facing things, young people, you think I was talking to a high schooler this morning, and they're like, my life is so horrible, I go to school all day, and it's work, and they're telling me how many work hours they have. And I realize, as I'm talking to them, they start counting school as work hours. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not right. Like, you're a senior. Like, I remember my senior year still. I remember that I did almost nothing my senior year. Like, we had chair races down the hall my senior year. I'm like, that doesn't count as work. Like, you brainlessly sit at a desk. Like, you don't know what real trial is yet. Anybody ever heard that in their life? All the high schoolers in the room are like, you don't know my struggle? You don't know what I've been through? And I'm like, I do, but don't let the gray hair fool you on my head. And the thing is, though, is like we look at these trials and we face things and we think like it is the hardest mountain. And instantly, instead of looking at the opportunity in the moment, we look back to what we know. We retreat back to what is safe. We retreat back. And so the Israelites find themselves in this place where Pharaoh is bearing down on them. He wants to drag them back to slavery or kill them. And they're saying, send us back. The slaves that were just freed are begging to go back into slavery. And so why do they get to this point? And why does this happen? And the funny thing is that we're surprised. The Israelites are surprised that opposition is coming at them during their breakthrough. And I think we struggle with the same thing. If we're honest with ourselves in this room, every time God begins to take ground in your life, or you begin to find freedom, or provision starts to come, maybe you have a business and you've been praying for God to make a way, or you've been praying God to open up opportunity, or maybe it's with your children, or maybe you're a young person and you're looking for direction in your life. We wonder why every time there is promise, there is opportunity, God gives us provision, opposition always follows. And we're surprised by it because we're not prepared for it. See, the enemy is not foolish. The enemy knows how to get you. The enemy knows when God begins to bless you, when God begins to free you, when you're on that road toward opportunity, toward the promise, the enemy is going to try to swoop in and drag you back to what you know. Maybe it's through a relationship. Maybe it's through dysfunction. And we fall back into these habits just like the Israelites do because we're shocked when things go wrong. Anybody ever done renovation projects? Anybody, you're a home fixer. I've done many renovation projects and I hurt myself during almost every single one of them. There's a family that comes to our church because I put a saw through my hand when we first moved here. And Lauren says anytime I'm doing something, she's like, you're gonna hurt yourself. Like she's just prepared. She like gets the Band-Aids out. She's like, something bad is gonna happen. But I love doing it, right? But here's the thing, I've done lots of renovation projects. And every time I go into one, and maybe you're the same way, I think everything's going to go perfect. Everything is going to go exactly how I planned. And so when things go wrong, right, and things aren't fitting the way I want them to, right, carpentry, it's the worst. It doesn't matter. You're supposed to measure and measure and measure before you do a cut, right? My grandpa always says, like, measure 3 times because you're probably doing it wrong. And when I was younger, I'd measure once and be like, I'm perfect. I don't make mistakes. I found out I make a lot of mistakes. And we get shocked because we plan something, and when it doesn't go as planned, it derails our lives. And so what can we learn from this story? What can we learn as God is leading his people out of slavery? They're wanting to turn back. What can we learn? How does God respond to his children turning their back on the promise? There's 3 things I want to talk about today. 3 things that I want to take away from this story because there's 3 responses God gives to the Israelites. I'm not usually a 3-point, write these 3 points down, they'll change your life. Yeah, TD Jakes, right? And that's not usually my thing, but there are 3 specific things God says to Moses to tell the people of Israel. And I think those are 3 things that will help you find freedom, that will help you find promise in the chaos, that will help you push through opposition. And so the first thing that happens, the first thing that we can take from this story is you need to learn to stand still. You need to learn to stand still, to not panic, to not freak out. Have you ever been in a situation where it just seems bigger, you don't know how to handle it, right? Anybody ever been in a crazy situation where you freaked out in the middle of it? Some of you are like, that was my morning this morning trying to get out of the house. But I remember when my son was born, Logan, we were living in Baltimore. First kid, and parents are psychopaths with their first kid because they don't know what to do. And so we had been preparing for my son to be born. And God's perfect timing, he was born early. And I remember laying in bed, and I always joke, I said, if I knew the last night I was going to get a real night's sleep, I would have went to bed early, I would have taken NyQuil, I would have done whatever to sleep the maximum amount possible. And I remember Lauren waking me up and saying, I think my water just broke, and I like shoot her off, like, right? Any husbands like, I'm like, woman, leave me alone, I'm sleeping. And as I laid there, it began to compute, like, wait a second, she just said her water broke. And I remember I jumped out. I went from like laying down to vertical in like 0.1 second. That's the fastest I've ever moved in my life. And I started like freaking out. Like, right, I went into panic mode. And then we had a friend of ours, my buddy Kevin, he's a doctor now. He was in med school and he was living with us. So what do? Like, I'm still in like my boxers, like running through the house, like, I don't know what to do. And she's just like standing there staring at me. I run into Kevin's room. He's asleep. I'm like, Kevin, you're basically a doctor. What do I do? And so he jumps out of bed in like 0.3 seconds and he starts running around the house. So my pregnant wife with her water broke is standing in the middle of our bedroom as we're running around the house like maniacs. And Kevin, I kid you not, this is not a joke or an exaggeration. He starts running around going, we need to bubble wrap everything. We need to bubble wrap the house. He's freaking out in the house. We still joke about it. He just had his second child a couple days ago. So I always be like, we need to bubble wrap everything. When you get in those moments where it just seems too great, you're not quite sure how to handle it, the best thing you can do is to be like my wife, to calm down, to stand still where you're at, to not panic. Husbands, we are not so good at this most of the time. We freak out. We panic in moments. Our first reaction in stressful situations is to panic. And so in Exodus 14, verse 13, Moses tells the people right after they're pleading, let's go back. He turns to the people. He says, don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Everyone is screaming. This is not like a little conversation. This is a riot unfolding amongst the people. And Moses stands up, I imagine very stoic, stands up and just says, everybody just calm down, stand still. Which probably enraged them even more. Like, are you kidding me right now? Do you not see the army coming against us? He says, stand still and wait on the Lord. And I started to think about this. How often, when trial comes our way, we just go into the cyclone, right? Maybe it's, there's a lot of sickness going around. Maybe your house has been a sick haven of germs, right? Like a festering pool of germs. And you get delirious. You haven't slept. It's crazy. Maybe it's finances in your life. Maybe it's with your children. Maybe young people, it's with your future and thinking about college. And you're like, I got to apply at every school. I got to do everything. What am I going to do with my life? Like, we start thinking about what we're 18 and we're thinking about 40. And we're just like, why don't you just focus on like 19 or 20 or like what the next step is rather than where you'll be down the road. And we go into this panic and we freak out and we get lost in the stress because we don't know how to stand still. We don't know how to stop in the midst of the chaos. See, panic will make you turn back to slavery or oppression and turn your back on freedom. They're missing the move of God that is happening right around them. In a second, they forget that the God that just delivered them out of slavery is still with them. They just saw all the plagues and all the miracles, and they instantly forget about the promise because they lean into their panic. And so Moses commands the children, stand still, don't panic, wait on the Lord. And this is important because if we keep our focus on him, nothing around us seems so great to defeat us. What the enemy meant to defeat us, the Bible literally says God will crush it under his foot. He will crush the enemy under his heel. And so when you learn to stand still, you keep your focus in the right direction. You begin to listen, which leads to the next thing you need to do. So you need to stand still. You need to not panic. You need to not freak out. When work isn't going, when your kids aren't going the right way, when life isn't going the right way, don't start taking things into your own hands, but stand still and be calm. Listen. Moses goes on in Exodus 14:14. He says, the Lord himself will fight for you if you just stay calm. He says, if you just stop, if you just begin to listen, he will show up. Quit screaming, quit freaking out. He's going to come through. He did not call us out here to die. Anybody love hide and seek? I do. I play hide and seek everywhere. I was a manager at Abercrombie at one point in my life, and I would tell our kids, I should have probably gotten fired for it, but I was the manager. So I would tell our kids, if you can get the store folded down as fast as possible, we'll play hide and seek in the store. And I had a bunch of high school, college kids. They loved it. I was the greatest boss in the world. We had people hiding on the top of the clothes things. It got out of control sometimes, but it was the greatest game ever to play hide and seek in there. And so I love hide and seek. I love scaring people. I love all that stuff. But anybody ever played hide and seek in a cornfield? Any hillbillies in the room? Yeah. I grew up in the country, and you just run into a cornfield and you play hide and seek. It is the most painful game you will ever play in your life. Go, I dare you to go, some of you, go run through a cornfield after church. It will hurt. And so we would play hide and seek, and every time, it did not matter how many times we played, someone would get lost in the cornfield. And I remember one time I got lost in the cornfield, and you just start running in circles, right? You're like, oh my gosh, and these are big fields. These aren't like little corn maze. And we're like, I'm running around. And for like a half hour, I was just in a panic running through. And if I would have probably just kept going straight, I would have got out at one point. But you start going in circles. You start doubting yourself. You start freaking out. And I remember what happened was I got to the point where I was like panicking. Like you start to think like I'm going to die in a cornfield. Like this is not how I want to go out. And so I at one point I just stopped and I just stood still. And you could hear some people, you could hear some things. But I remembered that the road was at the one end of the cornfield. And if I would listen to the cars, if I would listen to the trucks driving by, I would find my way out. So I started listening, and it led me out of the field. Let me tell you something. We get into these moments where we face trials, we face chaos, we face dysfunction, and we forget to stop and listen. We forget to slow down. We forget to use what's around us. And this is what God is telling the Israelites. Stop and listen to the Lord. Quit freaking out. And what it says in the Bible, it says God shows up as a pillar of fire and rains down from the heavens. He shows up to slow down the Egyptians. All they had to do, though, was get their attention fixed on him. Church, how often do we forget to listen? We go to God with our problems. We petition him with what we need. But how often do we sit down and just say, God, I'm not going to ask you for anything. What would you say to me? God, I know I need all of these things, but maybe you're directing me a different way, right? When we went to Plant Anchor, we thought we had a plan. We came up with a plan. It was a great plan. It was a perfect plan. But when we stopped and began to listen to God, he directed us somewhere else. And I wonder how often we would avoid extra chaos in our lives, extra opposition in our lives if we would just learn to sit and listen. No AirPods, no headphones, no sermon. Just listen on the Lord. And so Moses says to calm down, begin to listen. God didn't call us here to die. And he says, if we listen, if we wait on the Lord, he will show up. And God shows up as a pillar of fire. And Moses moves on to the third thing. The third thing, Exodus 14, verse 15 through 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me still? They're still complaining. He says, tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff, raise your hands over the sea, divide the waters so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea to dry ground. The third thing when you are facing opposition is you have to get to the point where you quit standing in the moment and you start moving to his cadence. You have to start walking in faith. The whole series, this Painted Desert series we're in, the story of the Israelites, is about the Israelites getting to a point, facing opposition, and learning to walk in faith. See, I think we have a faith problem. I think we have a faith problem in our lives because we love to bring up the dysfunction. We love to talk about what's wrong. We love to talk about what we need. But we don't know how to walk in faith. We don't know how to listen to his cadence. We don't know how to believe that he has a breakthrough. And the Israelites get to this point where they've been complaining and they're still complaining. And God has showed up again. And they're still standing there in awe of who God is. And God finally says, what are you crying for? Go. And Moses raises his hands and the water begins to part. But if they wouldn't have learned to stand still, if they wouldn't have learned to listen, they would have never gotten to the breakthrough. But how often do we get through the breakthrough and we want to just stay in what we know? We want to stay in our dysfunction. We want to stay in our brokenness. We want to stay as like a crutch, like this is my identity. We build our identity around the chaos. The Israelites had built their identity as slaves. So even when they were free, they still operated as a slave. It was all they ever knew. I was reading an article this week, Shawshank Redemption. Anybody love that movie? Band, if you want to get ready. Shawshank Redemption, great movie. It was like one of the anniversaries of it, and they were interviewing one of the main actor. I don't even know his name because I'm horrible with names. But they're interviewing the main actor, and they're talking about what was the most challenging scene in the movie. And he's the guy who crawls through the sewage pipe at the end of it to get free. And he's saying that wasn't the worst. Like, that wasn't the worst to act out because obviously it wasn't a real sewage pipe. It was hard to crawl through. But he said that scene at the end when he gets out of the tube and he falls into the ditch and it's raining, he said that was a real life ditch. That wasn't made. There was like field runoff and animal. Like he said that water was disgusting when I fell into it. And we all think acting's glorious, but that doesn't sound so glorious to me, like laying in a ditch of poopy water. And so he falls into this water and he gets free. But the story, if you've seen Shawshank Redemption, is they talk over and over again in this story how people get free. They finally get out of jail, and they don't know how to live in the real world. And so Morgan Freeman's character actually gets free, and he shows up at this hotel where most of the inmates go. And on the ceiling, there's different names where these inmates have actually hung themselves. Because they didn't know how to live as free men, they only knew how to be a prisoner, a slave. And so either they go back to jail, which I think is still true in our world today. This isn't just a movie. They talk, if you've heard anything about our prison system, is that people learn to live as prisoners. They don't know how to operate in the real world. So you have these criminals that will actually get out of jail, and they will do things just so they can get back in. Because we only know how to live as slaves. And maybe you're not a prisoner in this room this morning. This isn't jail. But I think so often in our lives, we're held captive to our past, to our dysfunction, to our brokenness, that when God begins to move and set us free, we see him speaking to us. We hear where he's calling us. The only thing we know to go back to is our brokenness. And so over and over again, we find ourselves living as children of God, but looking back at our past. And so you see people go over and over again, and they keep falling back into their sin, or they don't really find freedom. Or I remember even as a young person, I felt like I had to get saved at every altar call. I've talked about this before. Like the pastor would say, like, who needs saved? I'd be like, I'm getting saved every time. I don't want to go to hell, right? It was out of fear. I was like, send me forward. I need Jesus right now. Because we learn to live as broken slaves. The Israelites are standing, they have the pillar of God at their back. The Red Sea is parted. God is moving, and they're still looking back to Egypt. Moses has to yell at them like, what are you doing? Let's go. God has made a way. And we're going to get into this in the next couple weeks. We have 2 more weeks of the series. But the interesting thing is God shows up, stops the army. God shows up, parts the Red Sea. They go through. The Egyptian army is wiped out in that moment in the Red Sea. And they travel into the wilderness. And Moses goes up on a mountain to commune with God. And what do the Israelites do? They start living as slaves again. They don't know how to be in the moment. They don't know how to wait on the Lord. And so they go right back to what they know, and then they start building these fake gods, because remember, they grew up in Israel and in Egypt, and they had lived in Egypt generationally. So all they knew was a bunch of gods, and we just worship whatever we need to get what we want. And they had just seen the one true God move in their life to free them from their slavery. He literally wipes out the opposition. And they go back to being slaves. And God comes down and the 10 Commandments happen and that whole thing. And they go into the wilderness and they're getting punished. And God's saying you're going to have to wait to receive the promise. And every time opposition comes, what do? They look back to their slavery. Church, at some point, you need to start operating as a son or a daughter and quit living as a slave. At some point, you need to step into God's process, step into his freedom instead of leaning back into your past. You have to find release because God did not make you to live under the bondage of sin, but to find freedom and grace and hope and peace that comes through the cross. God doesn't want you to get dragged through your past, to get dragged through the mud. You don't have to keep living it over and over and over again if you give it to him. And the Israelites go through this process through the whole book of Exodus. I'm actually going to the end right now. I'll give you the hint, right? I'm going to give you the ending of the story. They go through this whole book of Exodus, struggling with this idea of faith and freedom. And then they finally walk into the promised land. And they finally receive what God had prepared them for. And what's interesting about the book of Exodus is we think it ends there. But this struggle with faith continues all the way through to Revelation today. See, I think the curse of our humanity is a thin red line that runs within all of us. That we can continue to live in bondage or we can learn to walk in freedom. Some of you have lived in bondage your whole life. Some of you have found freedom and you've accepted Christ and you love Jesus, and that's not what I'm talking about right now. If you don't know Jesus, man, God can free your life and you can find a wholeness in him. Yes, that is available. But I would say, if you're a believer in the room, are you a free child of God, or are you a slave to your past? Are you a slave to anxiety? Are you a slave to depression? Are you a slave to your past choices? Are you a slave to maybe what you've walked through or what you struggled with? Or have you found the freedom that comes through Jesus on the cross? Are you shocked when opposition comes? Or do you find freedom in the opportunity? Because you know the one who's paved the way. You know the one who's called you, that he hasn't abandoned you. Churches, we need to stop being... I think we have this issue in the church world. I think we live in more bondage than those that don't know Jesus. What do I mean by that? I think we're addicted to dysfunction. We're addicted to our past. We're addicted to brokenness. And so when we begin to find freedom, just like a prisoner, right? Shawshank Redemption, when you finally get out of what you've been bondage to, your first reaction is to turn back. And so this morning, God wants you to let go of some stuff. We're going to sing a song. We've sung it every week. We're singing it every week of this series. And it's a Leland song. John, we've talked about it a bunch. Like did I say the right band? Leland, right? Yeah, okay. I actually believe this. John is the one who said it. I'm not going to steal it as my own. But there's a special anointing on this song. And I think the words are anointed: waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. That's who you are. It's a song declaring who God is, declaring God's goodness, because I think we're living in an age of bondage. I think we're living in an age where we don't know true freedom. Depression is on the rise. Everyone seems to have anxiety. Now, you could argue whether it's real or not or whatever, but everyone seems to feel some sort of anxiety. And so our reaction is to clam up and stay in that, I just have to be this person. Instead of standing still, staying calm, and learning to move. So this morning as we sing this song, What do you need to give to God? I know what I need to give to God. My fear of control. I want to control everything, even with Anchor. I want to control it, God. If it's not working the way I imagined it or the way I believe it, I need to control it. I need to do everything. And God's saying, you need to learn to let go. You need to learn to trust me. You need to learn to trust the process. What's God telling you to let go of this morning? Maybe you don't know. Maybe you need to sit and not sing. Maybe you need to learn to sit still and just listen while everyone else is worshiping around you. What in your life are you controlling? Maybe it's with him. Maybe you've been around church your whole life. You've heard the message of the gospel. You know who Jesus is, but you don't fully buy into it. You don't trust it. Because how could a God love you so much to give up his own child? It just seems so crazy. So I'm just going to hold on to what I know because I believe it to be true, rather than believing there's someone in the heavens. There's someone so powerful and so mighty that loves you right here in Sylvania, Ohio, in this little blip on the map, that he would give up his own child for you. Maybe you need to learn into the seat of grace. You need to lean into his presence this morning. Maybe you need to lay down your anxiety. Maybe you need to lay down your depression. Maybe you need to lay down your finances, right? And say, God, it's not my money, it's your money. And so I give it all back to you because I don't want to live as a slave to my bank account. Maybe it's your children. That's a hard one. Maybe you need to give your kids back to God. Say, God, they're yours. I trust you. Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's your future. Maybe it's your relationship. Whatever it is, will you live as a slave, or will you learn to walk in freedom, in his wholeness, in his goodness? Let's pray today. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you. God, I thank you for who you are. God, I thank you for your goodness. God, I thank you that you're a God that doesn't abandon us, that doesn't leave us. That God, when you call us into a place, you don't ask us to walk on our own, but you are right behind us. God, you are leading us, you're around us, you're protecting us. God, if we would just acknowledge your presence. And so today, God, we acknowledge who you are. We acknowledge your goodness. We acknowledge your might. And God, I ask whatever anybody in this room is dealing with, whatever they're living as a slave to, whatever bondage is controlling them, God, I pray that they would find release right now. God, I pray that your Holy Spirit would move right now. God, I pray that you would just begin to sweep through this place in your might, in your wonder, in your greatness. God, I pray that people would not walk out of here the same way they walked in. God, I pray that every single person would walk out of this room with a sense of freedom, with a sense of provision, God, with a sense of holiness, God, that your stamp of approval is on their life. God, that you have made a way for them even when they don't see a way. God, that you have decreed some great things in their life that they don't understand. God, that you have provided for them and they have not received it yet. But God, their job is to have faith in you, to walk in your goodness, to walk in your faith, God, in your greatness. And so God, this morning, I pray right now that you would commune with every person in this room. God, that you would meet every person right where they're at. God, that they would be met with the presence of who you are, the freedom of who you are, and the goodness of who you are. And God, that we would have an abundance of faith, an unflowing, immeasurable faith right now. In Jesus' name, amen.